React, in its purest form, is a library for building user interfaces. It's so simple that the entire mental model can be represented as a formula. If we break it down, we've seen how you create your view with JSX and how you encapsulate that view inside of a function to get your component. But there's still one piece of the formula we haven't talked about: state, and specifically, the ability for individual components to own and manage their own state. This is what makes React so powerful, and it's what allows you to build complex user interfaces out of simple, isolated components. So what does adding state to a component look like? Let's say we were building a simple counter app that keeps track of how many times a user has clicked a button. Your first assumption might be to do something like this. After all, React is just JavaScript, right? And the way you add state to a function is by creating a variable. Unfortunately, this won't work. Can you spot why? Ironically, it won't work for the same reason, because React is just JavaScript, and that's not how JavaScript works. This is clear if we take React out of the picture entirely. Here's a normal JavaScript function. Without React, you wouldn't expect the count variable to persist across different function invocations. Each invocation is its own isolated environment with its own scope and context. With React, it's no different. So how do we get around this? Well, we need some help from React. Specifically, we need a way to tell React to preserve the value of count between different invocations of our counter function. React refers to these function component invocations as renders. Lucky for us, React comes with a hook that does exactly this, called useState. Now, before we get into useState, what in the world is a hook? You can think of hooks as special functions that allow you to get help from React. The reason they're special is because they have a few limitations. Namely, that they must start with use, and you can't call hooks inside conditions, loops, or other nested functions. We'll go much deeper into hooks throughout the course, but here's a simple mental model you can use for them. Hooks are just functions, but it's helpful to think of them as unconditional declarations about your component's needs. You use React features at the top of your component, similar to how you import modules at the top of your file. Okay, let's go back to useState now. useState is the blessed way to preserve a value across component renders. It comes built in with React and can be accessed via react.useState. It takes in a single argument, the initial value for the piece of state, and returns an array with the first item being the state value and the second item being a way to update that state. You may notice that this code feels a little clunky. This stems from the fact that useState returns an array. We can clean this up by using array destructuring. If you're not familiar, array destructuring allows you to pluck multiple items from an array and assign them to variables in bulk. So now that we know the purpose of useState as well as how it works, we can update our counter example from earlier to use it. Now, regardless of how many times React renders our component, the value of count will persist across all of those different renders. But this does bring up an interesting question. When does React render our component exactly? We have a whole lesson dedicated to this question later in the course, but here's a sneak preview. The answer is surprisingly simple. React re-renders a component whenever its state changes.